Greetings, my wonderful jealous spoons, and welcome back to another episode of Monday Madness, the Monday show where I talk about anything and everything. And today, sticking with the theme of a fantastical, we are talking about fathers. Well, specifically, one father. The father from the fantastical story of Peter Pan and the Neverland, and this father being, of course, Mr. Darling. So happy Father's Day to anyone who was celebrating it yesterday, and let's get on with talking about this wonderful and very underrated character. Now, I've often said that Mr. Darling is truly the main character of the Peter Pan story, and this is predominantly because he is the only character who has an arc. He has a growth, a redemption arc. He has a character arc, a full one. He has a redemption and a change and a growth that nobody else has or needs. And that's what makes Mr. Darling as a character so truly fascinating and so truly wonderful, and sadly, so underutilized and undervalued by many adaptations over the years. So let's talk about it. First off, I want to talk you through everything that we do know about Mr. Darling's character, the little glimpses we have into his appearance and his mannerisms and who he is. Who is this man? Well, his name is George Darling, and he is married to Mrs. Darling. There's a bit of funny information about how Mr. and Mrs. Darling first got together in the novel as well. J.M. Barrie writes that many men simultaneously realised that they were in love with Mary and raced to her house to propose to her, but Mr. Darling took a cab and therefore nipped in first, and that's how he got her. So at the beginning of the story, the things we know about Mr. Darling as a character are these. He can be boastful, and he likes to feel respected and admired by those around him, including his family and his neighbours. J.M. Barrie also describes him as one of those deep ones who knows about stocks and shares. He's also described as being really proud of Wendy and of his other children. Mr. Darling's way of working things out is with a pen and paper, so whenever he is faced with a challenge, like when they first had their daughter Wendy and the family had to work out whether they could afford to keep her, he sat down and wrote everything out, totting things up over and over again on a piece of paper. When concentrating, Mr. Darling does not like interruptions because it means he has to start all over again and it interrupts his train of thought. Can relate. He is also definitely an overthinker and a chronic worrier. He is described as having a passion for being exactly like his neighbours. And while Mr. Darling knows that Nana the dog is a wonderful nurse, he does still worry whether the neighbours talk about them. He also worries that Nana the dog does not respect him in the way that he wishes to be respected. The entire family, including Mr. Darling, will dance together. They will have gay romps on certain nights of the week, and this will be where the family is at their most loving. This is a fact that I really like about Mr. Darling. So when he is really concentrating, particularly when he's doing difficult maths and sums, like totting up winter greatcoats and how much things will cost for the family, he wraps a wet towel around his head to keep his brain clear. We also hear Mr. Darling speak some Latin phrases like mea culpa, and J.M. Barrie says that he did have a classical education. This is interesting because it runs in parallel to the character of Captain Hook, who is often a duo role played by the same actor, Mr. Darling and Captain Hook. And Captain Hook was educated at Eton, and his final words are Floriet Etona, Eton School's motto. So something the two of them have a little bit in common there is that classical education. We also know that Mr. Darling will very willingly talk about things over and over again, particularly with his wife, Mrs. Darling. She worries about things like Peter Pan and the children, and while he has heard these worries many times before, Mr. Darling is still happy to talk about them over and over again. And later, when the children have flown away, he will talk about it over and over again with his wife, happy to relive the situation over and over again, just to try to get this sadness out, and to help his wife as well. We also know that the Darling family are quite poor, and this is why Mr. Darling has to spend so much time totting things up and doing all this mental maths. Firstly, to work out whether they could afford to keep their children, and later to work out how to afford to clothe them and feed them and keep them with medicine and things like that. And within knowing that this family is poor, we also learn that Mr. Darling treasures his few really precious possessions. At the beginning of the story, Mr. Darling has a brand new pair of trousers with braid on them. He's about to wear them to go out to a party with his wife, and he is frightfully proud of these trousers and really excited to have them. And so we can understand then why, when Nana brushes against his leg and covers these brand new braided trousers in dog hair, why his lip starts to tremble and he does get quite frustrated and upset about this. While yes, it might seem a trifle, really to this man it's one of the few lovely possessions that he has and he can't really afford. And so it now being covered in dog hair explains why his behaviour is a little off in that first scene. We also learn that Mr. Darling mistakenly, genuinely believes that throughout his entire life, he took medicine without a murmur. He always took it boldly and never complained. Yeah, that's not true at all, but he believes it, a bit like Peter believing several things about himself that are not necessarily true. Mr. Darling, we can allow to hold on to this, but it is not true. J.M. Barrie also describes how the man has a proud heart. You can definitely see this in the way that he behaves and he thinks as well. Mr. Darling also has a self-described fatal gift of humour. And while sometimes his jokes will work and will land, and he clearly can be a really enjoyable character, there are some moments where he pushes the joke a little too far and is sometimes a bit self-serving, particularly at the beginning of the story. One of these instances involves Nana the dog. At this point in the story, Nana has already brushed against his trousers, leaving them covered in dog fur, and then he had a sort of standoff with one of his children where Michael was being forced to take his medicine, and Mr. Darling was claiming he always took his medicine well, and then when challenged to do so by his children, he was not able to take it as he did not want to take his frightfully awful medicine. So his children were very disappointed in him, and in an attempt to win them back on side using his fatal gift of humour, Mr. Darling poured his medicine into Nana's bowl, offering it to her pretending it was a drink of milk. Nana then drank it, looked disgusted, and looked so disappointed at him, and then she walked away. The children rushed to go and comfort Nana, and this only made Mr. Darling's proud heart break more, feeling that Nana was more appreciated than he was in his house. The dog that, bear in mind, has just ruined his brand new trousers, the one new thing he's probably had for a while, and his children, who he's been trying to entertain, are, even though the joke really wasn't a very good one, they are not respecting him and they're not appreciating what he's trying to do for them. So while it is a fatal gift of humour really, because it isn't always very good, bless him, he is trying, it's just not succeeding. We also have a tiny physical description of Mr. Darling, where later on J.M. Barrie talks about him and says if only he could have taken his baldness off, in reference to something else, meaning that Mr. Darling has either a bald spot or not a lot of hair or some hair, so any variation of that you can imagine, Mr. Darling has a little bit of baldness potentially as well. That is pretty much it that we know about him at the beginning of the story. It is quite a lot, that was quite a long list, I wrote it out, it took up a page and a half of A4. He is a truly interesting character. I would argue Mr. Darling is almost as nuanced as Captain Hook, and again, they are often played by the same actor, so that does make quite a lot of sense. I will not be talking about the character of Captain Hook in this video though. I have already done some videos about him. This video for Father's Day is to talk about the father, Mr. Darling. So now I want to skip you to the end of the story and talk to you about the character arc and the journey that Mr. Darling goes on. From proud man who is really concerned about his neighbours to quite humble man who does a gesture that is quite remarkable. To explain exactly what happens and what becomes of Mr. Darling at the very end of the story, I want to read you a quick snippet from the text. For anyone who wants to find it, this is in chapter 16, The Return Home. The only change to be seen in the night nursery is that between 9 and 6, the kennel is no longer there. When the children flew away, Mr. Darling felt in his bones that all the blame was his for having chained Nana up, and that from first to last, she had been wiser than he. Of course, as we have seen, he was quite a simple man. Indeed, he might have passed for a boy if, again, he had been able to take his baldness off. But he had also a noble sense of justice and a lion courage to do what seemed right to him. And having thought the matter out with anxious care after the flight of the children, he went down on all fours and crawled into the kennel. To all Mrs. Darling's dear invitations to him to come out, he replied sadly but firmly, "No, my own one. This is the place for me." In the bitterness of his remorse, he swore that he would never leave the kennel until his children came back. Bear in mind that during this story of Peter Pan, we have not seen the Darling parents at all for several chapters at this point. The last time we saw them was in chapter 3, where they tiptoed quietly up the stairs to try to get to their nursery in time to stop their children from flying out of the window, but they were too late and the birds had flown. So in all of this time, between chapters 4 and chapter 16, we have not seen or heard from the Darling parents. There's another sentence that always really got me about Mr. Darling, and it's this one, again in chapter 16, The Return Home, and it said, "There never was a more humble man than the once proud George Darling, as he sat in the kennel of an evening talking with his wife of their children and all their pretty ways. Very touching was his deference to Nana. He would not let her come into the kennel, but on all other matters he followed her wishes implicitly." So Mr. Darling's attitude and character, personality, everything has taken a huge, almost 180 shift from, as J.M. Barrie said, the proud man at the beginning of the story, so concerned with what his neighbours thought, and now he's living in a dog kennel. And not just that, Mr. Darling is getting taken to and from work in the kennel. That's why between 9 and 6, it's not there. He gets taken in a cab. Each morning, the kennel was carried with Mr. Darling in it to a cab, which conveyed him to his office, and he returned home in the same way at 6. Something of the strength of character of the man will be seen if we remember how sensitive he was to the opinions of neighbours. This man whose every movement now attracted surprised attention. Inwardly, he must have suffered torture, but he preserved a calm exterior even when the young criticised his little home, and he always lifted his hat courteously to any lady who looked inside. So this man, this once proud, frightfully proud and strong man, is now publicly shaming himself, almost. He is showing the world that he is taking the blame and the fault onto himself, and he is embarrassing himself in a very public way, going to and from work, still able to keep his job and do his work and live his life, but his punishment is to be in a kennel, and he's sticking to it. He's not just in the kennel when he's at home, he's not just sleeping in the kennel, no, he's doing it to the extreme, and he is taking it all the way there. He said it, and he means it. His vow, his word, is as strong as Peter's in this sense. When Peter vows, hook or me this time, and follows through, Mr. Darling, by saying that this is the place for me, he's following through as well. And until his children come back, he is staying in this kennel, and he does. Soon, J.M. Barrie writes of Mr. Darling going back and forth to work in the kennel, the inward meaning of it leaked out, and the great heart of the public was touched. Crowds followed the cab, cheering it lustily. Charming girls scaled it to get his autograph. Interviews appeared in the better class of papers, and society invited him to dinner and added, "Do come in the kennel." We also later learned that all of this attention has not soured Mr. Darling's temperament, but actually made him even sweeter. Also bear in mind at this point that while the Darling parents and Nana are holding out hope that their children will one day return, and Mrs. Darling is leaving the window open for them always, it has been months at this point. There is no guarantee their children are ever coming back. And so they are resigning themselves to a life where Mrs. Darling can't quite sleep properly, and she's wandering the house, sort of like the Lady of the Lake in Bly Manor. And she's visioning her children, and she sees them in her dreams, and when she wakes, leaving the window open for them, playing sad songs on the piano, and Mr. Darling confining himself to the dog kennel. This could be the rest of their lives. They have no idea their children are coming back. So it's a really strong and powerful statement of just how committed Mr. Darling is to punishing himself and changing his personality and his character and his way of life. He could be in that kennel forever. He may never see his children again. Of course, it does have a happy ending. The children, Wendy, John and Michael, do come back. They fly through the nursery window. They are confused to see Mr. Darling sleeping in the dog kennel, and there's quite a sweet moment where Michael looks in at him and goes, "Oh, he's not so big as the pirate I killed," which is a good thing Mr. Darling was not awake to hear that. But when his children are back, they are all rejoicing. They are all so happy. Mr. Darling is delighted, and he is even very happy to adopt all of the lost boys. He just wants them to respect them and to ask his opinion on things. And when they agree to do that, he's delighted. He actually plays follow the leader with them and dances through the house, leading them around to find places for them all to sleep. So that's it. That's Mr. Darling's wonderful character arc, and hopefully you can understand why I love this character so much, and why I really wish that adaptions would just show more of him. Even Jason Isaacs, who did a wonderful job as Captain Hook, and his Mr. Darling was also fantastic, didn't really get to get his teeth into Mr. Darling at all. I wish they had shown us more. I wish that adaptions in the future would, and when I do mine, I will of course show a lot of Mr. Darling. I hope that you guys watching this video have come to understand him a little bit more as well, and even if you don't love him as much as I do, I hope you understand just how great this man's character arc and his growth is, and you can understand him just a little bit more. Alright, that is the end of today's episode of Monday Madness. I hope you guys had fun. I'll be back with you next week with a cosplay project that I am currently in the middle of working on. I am beyond excited for this. And it came out of nowhere and I really don't care. Alright, I'm going to go back to sewing and editing this video. I will see you in a week. Goodbye, my wonderful jelly spoons. Goodbye. Oh, also, in the spirit of Father's Day, let me know some of your favourite fathers. Father figures, probably in fiction. Father figures in fiction, that's fun to say. Chuck them down in the comments and let me know why you love them so much.